When I worked at City Mission, I would often go to speak to various groups, school groups, service club groups. And I remember vividly going to speak to a group out at Lancaster. It was at a time when there had been some publicity in the press about what they claimed were young girls who were deliberately getting pregnant so that they could receive government benefits. I didn't subscribe to that, by the way, but when it came to question time, one of the gentlemen there said to me, "John, some of us began life with disadvantage, and look at us now. Why don't these people help themselves?" And I'm sure that you've heard that in some way or another. In other words, it's their fault. And today's question is, whose sin caused this man's blindness? His own or his parents'? Now, it is very tempting for me to spend the next hour talking about that. Unfortunately, we need to get some photos later on, so that won't happen. But it's an interesting belief, isn't it, that you could sin while you're in your mother's womb. Or we could talk about the problem of suffering. And your homework for this week is to go home and get the book of Job and read it. It's just good for you to read it as English literature because it takes up the whole question of the problem of suffering. And to put it in modern day language, the question that it raises is this: why do bad things happen to good people? At the Methodist conference in England some years ago, the chairman looked at his watch, said it's 10 minutes to lunchtime, so let's deal with the apartheid problem. That's all you need for that, just 10 minutes. Well, perhaps you'd like me to speak for the next half hour about sin. I don't think I've ever preached about sin. I've seen a bit of it. But I'm reminded of the man who waited for his wife to come home from church and asked her, what was the new minister like? And his wife said she was all right. What did she preach about? She preached about sin. And what did she say about it? Well, she was against it. Or Dorothy Sayers, in one of her great books, not her detective novels or her plays, but her book of theology, says, I am concerned that churches are more concerned about what happens in the bedroom than in what happens in the boardroom. So we could have a good discussion on sin, and we could look at the Old Testament view that if you were good, you would be healthy and wealthy and have lots of children, and if you were bad, you would be sick and poor and have no children. The view is that calamity is the wages of sin. And of course, Jesus had something to say about that. He said, those people on whom the tower fell, the 18 who were killed, were they any worse than people who didn't have the tower fall on them? And so we could talk about suffering. You may have heard me mention in the last so many years one of my heroes, Arthur John Gossip. He preached a sermon in the morning at his church, and that afternoon, without any warning, his wife died. And he wrote, I know a poor soul whose wife was taken from him without warning. And to rally his own heart, he wrote a sermon that was published long ago. From that day, hundreds of letters have reached him from all over the world, telling him that it was not for nothing that his heart was broken. It had to break, that God through you might help and steady our stunned, lost souls. A very brave thing to say. But if you look at what the reading says, it's suggesting that our fate is tied up with that of our parents. And this is partly true. I know that when I was working with homeless men in North Melbourne, quite often they would tell me of the things that they'd had to endure when they were children, and basically saying, this has coloured my life. What our fathers and mothers did, that is what determined who I am today. Well, it may determine where we start off, but it doesn't determine where we go. I remember when I was quite a good golfer, actually, although I say it myself. I went to a little country golf course to play, and a man came along. He was even older than I was, and he had a canvas bag with half a dozen clubs in the back. And I thought, well, this is going to be easy, isn't it, eh? Well, he thrashed me completely, and I recognised that it's not the equipment you have, but what you do with it. And so the question, whose fault is it that he was born blind? And Jesus is saying, is that really a question you want to know about? Are you just being curious? This man's blindness was a challenge to action rather than a mere intellectual problem or an ethical puzzle. Jesus is saying, this man is someone in need. He should be an object of compassion. If you look up the definitions of compassion in several dictionaries, you'll find that there is a common feature in them. It's not just people who have pity, but it's people who have pity and do something about it. The disciples were asking the wrong question. What they should have been asking is, what can we do about it? Every Tuesday night in this church we have a discussion on the previous Sunday's sermon. And in that discussion, one phrase keeps on coming again and again. It's the phrase, random acts of kindness. It's something that we all need. Let me just tell you a couple of stories about this. I was speaking at a high school in the eastern suburbs, and it was the year 12 students, fairly formidable group, and at the back there was one who was bigger than all the rest, and I'd already judged him because he had red hair. Anyway, I got to the end of what I was saying, and he came up to me, and I thought, oh, here I am, I'm in trouble now. And he said to me, it's the school formal tonight, and I'm taking my girlfriend to the school formal, and we were going to get a taxi, but I think your homeless men need the money more than I do, and he gave me $20. A random act of kindness. At a time when I was going through a fairly difficult period and I needed help, and I rang two of my friends and said, look, I need help. And they said, well, it's Friday night and we're getting friends over tonight for dinner, but come on Monday and we'll have a chat. And I thanked them for that. Half an hour later, the phone went and it was Jane saying, look, we need to talk to you more than we need to have dinner with our friends, so we've cancelled them and you come this afternoon and talk to us. A random act of kindness. The story of the Good Samaritan talks about a random act of kindness. I was reading through that story and I was reminded of the boy who heard it for the first time, and when the teacher said, "Why do you think the priest passed by on the other side?" his answer was, well, perhaps he realised the man had already been robbed. Took a while to get through, didn't it, up there in the choir, but that's all right. You won't be surprised when I finish up with Matthew 25. Whatever you do for one of my brothers here, however humble, you do for me. I think some of you may have met Dr. Small, who came out to Australia from the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. He finishes one of his sermons with this story, and I think it's very appropriate. He said, I went to a church where a keen member had died with tragic suddenness. People were still, in their own way, writing his obituary. In other words, remarking upon what they remembered him with affection and esteem. They remembered that for 50 years he'd been a businessman of utter integrity, exercising an ever-increasing influence. They remembered that for 40 of those years he'd been an elder, and for the most part of that, the session clerk. But what they remembered most about him was that for the last year of his life, he'd got up half an hour earlier than he need do, gone around to the home of an old couple with no help, cleaned out the fireplace, lit the fire, and made their breakfast ready before he went to his office. No one will question that it will be important when the books of life are made up that exercise that influence in the community. But if Jesus' teaching is to be taken seriously, the most important part of his record will be, inasmuch as you have done it unto the least of these, my brothers, my sisters, you have done it to me. The end and the purpose of life is not to know, but to love. It is not by our cleverness, but by our compassion that we show the power of God at work. Amen.